Deal or no deal? At the risk of sounding a bit too much like Howie Mandel, that is the trillion-dollar question of the moment for Wall Street and for Washington. And if there is a deal on the fiscal cliff, what might it look like? We might have a pretty good idea in just a couple of minutes because, as you can see, Conrad is with us. He's the Democratic senator from North Dakota and the outgoing chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. With us from Washington, Senator Conrad, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Yesterday appeared to be an important day to those of us up here in New York because we saw a parade of CEOs down in Washington meeting with the president, meeting with members of Congress. Do you feel, on the basis of those meetings this morning, that the chances of reaching a deal on the fiscal cliff before January 1st are any better?
I do.
Why is that?
Those were very constructive. I thought those were very constructive meetings yesterday. I thought the business community helped bring a real sense of urgency to the discussions here and an understanding that this has economic consequences to the nation if we fail to get an agreement. I think most economists say we will go back into recession, that unemployment will tick up if there is not an agreement reached. And I think they also were very clear in saying, look, we are ready to pay more in taxes. We also think there needs to be some spending discipline as part of a package, but we're ready to pay more if we're assured that it's going to be used to get this deficit under control.
What is the biggest sticking point at this point in the conversation and in the debate?
I think there are a number of big sticking points, as you can imagine. Perhaps the biggest on the revenue side is the question of whether the top rate ought to be raised or whether eliminating tax deductions and exclusions or limiting them in some way is used to raise the revenue. I think that's the big question on the revenue side. On the spending side, it really revolves mostly around health care because that's the 800-pound gorilla. As you know, as a nation, we're spending 18% of our GDP, $1 in every 6 on health care. No other country is spending more than about $1 in every $9 on health care. So we've got a lot of room for savings in health care, in making our whole system more efficient. That will save money for Medicare and Medicaid.
On the tax issue, do you consider a joint income of $250,000 rich?
Well, it depends where you are. In North Dakota, you're pretty well off at $250,000. If you're in New York, not so much.
Well, the president wants to raise the rate on these households. Would you say that something that, like Warren Buffett proposed, 30% on $1 million or more, 35% on $10 million or more, is feasible?
I liked what Warren Buffett proposed a lot because, you know, if you look at the unfairness in the tax system, there are high-income people who are paying very close to the statutory rate of 35%. On the other hand, there are very wealthy people who are paying a fraction of that. We saw that in the campaign. We saw Mr. Romney paying a rate of 13% on massive income. And how can it be we have such differences? Well, the big reason for it is the differential on capital gains and dividends. They're taxed at a rate of only 15%, 1.5. Other income, earned income, is taxed at a rate of 35%. So my own belief is that differential needs to be addressed. Warren Buffett proposed one way of doing it, and it's, to me, an entirely reasonable way.
Senator, help us answer a question that we often ask here. How influential are people like Warren Buffett with senators and congressmen, both Democrats and Republicans, and not just Warren Buffett, perhaps the greatest investor who ever lived, but some of the other business people who were down in Washington yesterday, people like Muhtar Kent, the CEO of Coke, whom you almost never hear speak about fiscal policy, or Marissa Mayer, the new CEO at Yahoo, for example.
Look, I think it is very important when the leaders of some of the biggest, most respected companies in America come to town and say, hey, look, we are ready to pay somewhat more in taxes if we're assured that the money is used to reduce our deficit and debt and not wasted in some boondoggle spending program. On the other hand, you know, we always have to look with some skepticism. Are people down here promoting their own agenda? Do they want a tax agenda that somehow would benefit them and their companies, and they're not really looking out for the public interest? But
Senator,
I think
who are
most
these
of the people that
CEOs?
came,
In your mind, who are these CEOs talking to? Are they talking more to the Democrats? Or are they talking to the Republicans?
well, they've talked to both sides. I was in a
I
meeting
guess it's
yesterday.
more whom do they feel they have to move? You know, each side has its own intransigent position. Which one has to move the furthest to get to the point where we have a deal that these executives would support?
I think so far you've seen more resistance on the Republican side on revenue than you've seen on the Democratic side on almost any issue. But there are also people on the Democratic side that don't want to touch almost any spending category. So look, we've got to bring along people on both sides. But I think the business community really has an obligation or responsibility to help persuade Republicans, who by and large they support, to be part of a balanced plan.
Well, let's talk about some of your Democratic colleagues who have drawn a pretty hard line against cutting entitlement spending. Do you think there is a realistic compromise over cutting Social Security or Medicare?
Well, I think both sides have said Social Security should not be part of a deficit reduction deal because it has not been part of creating these deficits. Social Security has an issue with its solvency. We know that it's going to be its solvency is going to be in question in about 20 years. So most people have concluded that any changes to Social Security should be used not for the purposes of deficit reduction, but for the purposes of extending Social Security's solvency itself. With respect to Medicare and Medicaid, every bipartisan group that's come up with a recommendation has acknowledged there needs to be additional savings in Medicare and Medicaid. We're going to spend $11 trillion over the next 10 years on those two programs. Certainly we can have additional savings there, given the fact that in our country we are spending far more on health care than any other country in the world as a share of our national income. And almost everyone who's looked at this question has said there's a lot of waste in the system. There are a lot of places where we could have additional efficiency that would improve health care costs.
Senator, if you don't mind, I'd like to squeeze in a quick question before we go. We like to say that you're the senator with nothing to lose because you're retiring. Who among your fellow Democrats needs, name names, who needs to move on this issue for a deal to be reached?
No, I'm not going to name names. That may be useful for your purposes. That's not useful for the purposes of being constructive here and getting an agreement. What we've got to do is make the case, make it convincingly, make it in a compelling way, and hope that colleagues on both sides are ready to move. They're going to lose. Look, we're going to lose some on both sides at the end of the day here. The extremes on the right and the left, they're not going to go for any deal. What we need is the solid center to hold.
Senator, thank you very much. Fair enough, I should add. Nice to see you. He is the retiring senator from North Dakota, a Democrat. Ken Conrad with us here on Market Maker.